In quiet Flaxborough, Widow Millicent's funeral kiss reveals another woman's lipstick mark on her husband's coffin. Inspector Purbright must untangle gossip, poison, and theatrical revenge in this sly mystery. Where are you listening from today? The Flaxborough Parish Hall had been pressed into service for more solemn occasions than its faded green walls and squeaking floorboards might suggest appropriate. On this particular October afternoon, it housed the mortal remains of Mr. Cedric Whitmore, late proprietor of Whitmore, and Sons, Drapers, and Haberdashers, a man whose passing had been as punctual and unremarkable as his 43 years of opening the shop at precisely 9 o'clock each morning. The hall smelled of chrysanthemums and furniture polish, with an undertone of the boiled ham sandwiches that Mrs. Bracegirdle and her committee ladies had prepared with their usual efficiency. Folding chairs borrowed from the Methodist chapel had been arranged in respectful rows, though several showed an alarming tendency to collapse without warning, a hazard that added a subtle tension to the proceedings as mourners shifted their weight with the caution of people navigating thin ice. Mr. Whitmore's coffin, a sensible oak affair from Mossop and Crane's Middle Range, occupied the place of honor beneath a borrowed velvet drape that had seen service at numerous civic functions. The brass nameplate caught what little afternoon light filtered through the hall's modest windows, announcing with understated finality, Cedric James Whitmore, 1922 to 1965. The assembled company represented Flaxborough's commercial and social hierarchy with the precision of a well-rehearsed pageant. Councillor Haxby had positioned himself near the front, his black armband slightly askew in a way that suggested both grief and the importance of being seen to grieve properly. Mrs. Dabb from the Salon B had achieved an effect of mourning elegance that would undoubtedly influence local funeral fashion for months to come. Even Mr. Jevons from the Citizen had attended, his notebook discreetly concealed, but his eyes alert to any detail that might warrant the phrase touching scenes in Thursday's edition. Mrs. Millicent Whitmore, widow of 3 days, had received the condolences of the town with a composure that struck some as admirable and others as rather too well maintained. She wore black naturally, but it was a black that suggested careful selection rather than hasty assembly from the back of a wardrobe. Her hat, in particular, had drawn the attention of the more observant ladies present. It was new, expensive, and worn with the confidence of a woman who had given considerable thought to her appearance. The service itself had proceeded with the measured dignity that Flaxborough expected of such occasions. The Reverend Simeon Lanchester had delivered appropriate words about eternal rest and earthly duty, while Mrs. Pettigrew had managed the organ with her usual determination to complete each hymn regardless of how many voices remained to support her efforts. Now, as the time approached for the final journey to St. Bartholomew's churchyard, the congregation prepared for that moment of private farewell that custom demanded. Mrs. Whitmore rose from her chair in the front row with a movement that seemed both spontaneous and rehearsed. She approached the coffin with measured steps, her black-gloved hands clasped before her in an attitude of prayer. The hall fell silent, save for the distant rumble of a lorry passing on the Eastgate Road and the barely audible wheeze of Mr. Toffee's breathing, the cemetery groundskeeper having developed what he called a touch of the chest during his 40 years among the headstones. What followed would be discussed in drawing rooms and shop doorways for weeks to come, though each telling would add its own embellishments to the basic facts. Mrs. Whitmore paused beside the coffin, placed one hand upon the polished lid, and then, with a deliberation that seemed almost ceremonial, bent down and pressed her lips firmly against the brass nameplate. It was not the gentle kiss of a grieving widow bidding farewell to her beloved. There was something in the gesture, a lingering quality, a pressure that suggested satisfaction rather than sorrow, that sent a ripple of unease through the watching mourners. When she straightened, there was visible upon the brass plate a clear impression in coral-pink lipstick, and in her eyes, behind the modest veil, something that might have been relief. Mrs. Bracegirdle, whose powers of observation had been honed by 30 years of committee work, noticed immediately that the lipstick mark was not alone. Beside it, fainter but unmistakably present, was another impression, this one in a deeper shade, almost crimson and clearly older. The discovery prompted a small, involuntary intake of breath that carried further than intended in the hushed atmosphere of the hall. "Well," Mrs. Whitmore announced, her voice carrying clearly to the back rows, "I see I'm not the first to bid Cedric farewell in this manner." The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond, creating ripples of whispered speculation that spread through the assembled mourners with remarkable speed. Councillor Haxby cleared his throat with the authority of a man accustomed to calling meetings to order, while Mrs. Dabb leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who recognized a significant social development when she encountered Mr. Mossop, the undertaker, materialized beside the coffin with the silent efficiency that was his professional trademark. His pale hands produced a small cloth, and he began to address the lipstick marks with the discretion of a man who had learned that the dignity of death often required careful maintenance. As he worked, however, his cloth caught on something, a small resistance that made him pause and peer more closely at the velvet drape. Pinned to the underside of the pall, nearly invisible unless one were looking for it, was a tiny envelope of the sort used by chemists for powder papers. Mr. Mossop glanced quickly around the hall, noted the expectant faces turned in his direction, and made the sort of decision that separates the truly professional from the merely competent. With movements so subtle they might have been accidental, he detached the envelope and palmed it with practiced ease. But not quite easily enough. Mrs. Bracegirdle's sharp eyes had caught the gesture, and her slight nod to Mrs. Dabb conveyed volumes of shared understanding. Within moments, the knowledge that something had been found was circulating through the hall with the efficiency of a well-organized postal system. Inspector Purbright, who had positioned himself near the back of the hall with the unobtrusive skill of a man accustomed to observing without being observed, noted these developments with the calm attention he brought to all of Flaxborough's social ceremonies. He had attended not from any particular connection to the deceased, but because experience had taught him that the town's more interesting mysteries often began at precisely such gatherings. Purbright was a man of modest appearance and gentle manner, qualities that had served him well in a town where dramatic gestures were viewed with suspicion and loud voices were considered the mark of poor breeding. His grey suit was unremarkable, his tie properly subdued, and his expression one of polite attention that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Yet those who knew him well might have noticed the slight pressure of his thumb against his forefinger, a habit that emerged when his mind was engaged with something more complex than appeared on the surface. As the bearers prepared to lift the coffin for its final journey, Purbright found himself considering the curious tableau he had just witnessed. A widow's kiss that seemed more celebration than farewell. 2 lipstick marks where one might have been expected. A hidden envelope that had required professional discretion to conceal. And throughout it all, the subtle undercurrent of anticipation that suggested Flaxborough's social machinery had been presented with a puzzle worthy of its collective attention. The procession formed with the measured dignity that such occasions demanded, but as it moved toward the door, Purbright noticed that conversations had already begun in earnest. Heads bent together, voices dropped to the conspiratorial whisper that was the town's preferred method of information exchange, and glances were cast in directions that would later prove significant. By the time the last mourner had filed out into the grey afternoon, Inspector Purbright had reached a conclusion that would have surprised no one who knew his methods. The death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore, which had seemed so unremarkable in life, was beginning to develop the sort of complications that made small towns infinitely more interesting than their placid surfaces might suggest. He adjusted his hat to a thoughtful angle and stepped out into the Flaxborough afternoon, where the wind carried the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of revelations yet to come. The procession from the parish hall to St. Bartholomew's churchyard moved with the measured dignity that Flaxborough reserved for its more solemn occasions, though the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly from grief to something approaching anticipation. The October wind carried more than the scent of autumn leaves. It bore whispers that traveled from mourner to mourner with the efficiency of a well-organized postal system. Mrs. Bracegirdle had positioned herself strategically beside Mrs. Dabb, and their conversation proceeded with the crisp precision of two women accustomed to managing information as carefully as they managed their household budgets. Two distinct shades, Mrs. Bracegirdle was saying, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to reach interested ears. The coral was fresh, naturally, but that deeper mark, crimson I should say, had been there considerably longer. "Rather a bold choice for a respectable woman," Mrs. Dabb replied, her trained eye already cataloguing the implications. "Not the sort of thing one finds in Whitmore's own cosmetics counter. Something more. Metropolitan in its origins, I should think." Behind them, Mr. Jevons from the Citizen had produced his notebook with practiced discretion, his pencil moving across the page in quick, economical strokes. The journalist's instincts had been sharpened by years of transforming Flaxborough's mundane occurrences into readable copy, and he recognized that today's events had provided him with considerably more material than the usual touching scenes of local grief. Inspector Purbright, maintaining his unobtrusive position at the rear of the procession, observed these developments with the patient attention he brought to all of the town's social ceremonies. The widow's dramatic gesture had clearly shifted the focus from mourning to investigation, and the collective intelligence network of Flaxborough was already mobilizing with impressive efficiency. At the graveside, as the Reverend Lanchester delivered the necessary words about dust returning to dust, Mrs. Whitmore stood with a composure that struck many observers as remarkably well maintained for a woman who had just discovered evidence of another woman's intimate farewell to her deceased husband. Her black-gloved hands remained folded with mathematical precision, and her gaze never wavered from the coffin being lowered into the earth. It was during the final prayers that Mr. Mossop, the undertaker, found Inspector Purbright materializing beside him with a silent efficiency that marked the inspector's professional approach. "A word about that small discovery, Mr. Butt." "Mossop," Purbright murmured, his tone suggesting nothing more pressing than a casual inquiry about the weather. Mossop's relief was palpable as he surrendered the tiny envelope he had retrieved from beneath the velvet pall. "Pinned to the underside, Inspector, near the head of the coffin. Empty now, but it bears the mark of Hargreaves and Son, chemists, and there's a faint, rather bitter odor to the paper." Purbright examined the envelope with unhurried attention, noting its crisp condition and the discreet stamp that identified its origin. "Who had access to the pall this morning?" "Mrs. Bracegirdle supervised the laying out, naturally, and Mrs. Whitmore made 2 visits to adjust the draping, said it required proper symmetry for the service." As the mourners began to disperse, Purbright found himself observing a late arrival at the churchyard gate. The woman was perhaps 35, dressed in fashionable black that spoke of London rather than Flaxborough, and wearing lipstick in a deep crimson shade that several observers recognized with the sharp clarity of revelation. The newcomer's eyes scanned the assembled mourners with focused attention until her gaze fell upon Mrs. Whitmore. The moment of recognition that passed between them carried the weight of shared history, and Mrs. Whitmore's acknowledgment was delivered with the sort of public politeness that concealed private knowledge. "Miss Carmichael," the widow called across the churchyard, her voice carrying clearly in the autumn air. "How thoughtful of you to come." Miss Carmichael inclined her head without speaking and departed, her heels clicking against the cobblestones with a rhythm that seemed to emphasize the significance of her brief appearance. The return to the parish hall for tea provided ample opportunity for the sort of informal intelligence gathering that made Flaxborough's social network more efficient than any official communication system. Mrs. Bracegirdle had established herself near the tea urn, from which position she could observe and direct the flow of information with military precision. The shop girls at Whitmore and Sons might have interesting observations, she remarked to Mrs. Dabb, who nodded with the focused attention of someone receiving valuable intelligence. Miss Pert and Miss Sims have always been most observant about the comings and goings. Indeed, when Purbright made his unhurried way to the draper's shop later that afternoon, he found the young ladies eager to share their recollections. Miss Valerie Pert, adjusting black ties in the window display, spoke with the precision of someone who had given considerable thought to recent events. He was most particular about his routines, Inspector. Everything just so, except on Thursday evenings when he stayed late with the books. And there was that lady who came by the alley door a fortnight past. Well-dressed, wearing that deep red lipstick that clung so. Said she required a private fitting, though she left without purchasing anything. Miss Nora Sims added her own observations about the visitor's sophisticated appearance and foreign perfume, details that painted a picture of someone quite outside Flaxborough's usual social circle. Dr. Malley, encountered on his way back from certifying the burial, confirmed what Purbright had already surmised about the medical aspects of Mr. Whitmore's demise. Heart failure, Inspector. The man's father went the same way. I'd advised him about his diet. Too many pickles with his lunch, I thought. Nothing suspicious in the medical sense, though I confess the afternoon's developments have given me pause for reflection. As evening settled over Flaxborough with its customary punctuality, Inspector Purbright returned to the station and placed the chemist's envelope in the drawer where he kept such promising trifles. On a sheet of paper he wrote, Hargreaves. Widow, Paul red lipstick, Miss Carmichael. Then, because thoroughness was his professional habit, he underlined Miss Carmichael twice. The death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore, which had begun as a routine matter of natural causes, was developing the sort of complications that made small towns infinitely more interesting than their placid surfaces might suggest. Purbright adjusted his lamp and prepared to consider the curious dynamics that had emerged from what should have been a simple funeral, knowing that in Flaxborough the most intriguing mysteries often began with the most ordinary of circumstances. The morning following Mr. Whitmore's interment brought to Flaxborough that particular quality of autumnal clarity that made even the most mundane shop fronts appear touched with significance. Inspector Purbright arrived at his office to find that overnight reflections had arranged themselves into the sort of orderly patterns that suggested a case developing along lines more complex than natural causes might warrant. Sergeant Malley had prepared his customary summary with the thoroughness of a man who understood that in Flaxborough the most innocent details often proved the most illuminating. 3 telephone inquiries, Inspector, all concerning yesterday's proceedings. Mrs. Bracegirdle wishes to clarify her observations about the poll arrangements. Mr. Jevons from the Citizen seeks guidance on the proper reporting of unusual funeral incidents, and a Miss Carmichael has requested an interview at your earliest convenience. Purbright accepted this intelligence with the calm attention he brought to all morning reports, though his thumb pressed against his forefinger in that subtle gesture which indicated heightened interest. The convergence of official curiosity and voluntary cooperation suggested that Flaxborough's social machinery had identified something worthy of collective investigation. His first call was upon Hargreaves and Son, chemists, where Mr. Wilfred Hargreaves presided over his domain of tinctures and tonics with the precision of a man who understood that public health depended upon accurate measurements. The small envelope lay between them on the counter like a piece of evidence awaiting judgment. Gentian powder, I should say, Mr. Hargreaves pronounced after a delicate sniff. Or possibly quinine. We use these papers for both. Digestive aids and fever tonics, common as rain in a town where people take their health seriously. Recent sales that you might recall. Indeed, Inspector. Mr. Whitmore himself collected a quantity of gentian mixture last week. called it his salvation after luncheon, poor fellow. His digestion had grown troublesome of late. Hargreaves paused, consulting a ledger with professional care. Also, a lady visitor some days past. Not local, London, I should judge by her manner. Purchased our deepest shade of lipstick, passion red, along with some digestive powders and a vial of complexion tonic. Purbright noted the convergence of evidence with quiet satisfaction. This lady, might you describe her? Striking, Inspector. Dark hair, expensive clothes, and that particular confidence that comes from knowing one's place in the world. She paid in notes, crisp ones, and mentioned visiting old friends in the district. Left her umbrella behind, as it happens. Silver handle, shaped like a swan's head. Still have it in the back room. The umbrella, when produced, bore the initials DC engraved in flowing script upon a small silver plate. Purbright examined it with the unhurried attention he brought to all promising evidence, noting the quality of the workmanship and the slight wear that suggested regular use by someone accustomed to London weather. From Hargreaves, it was a brief walk to Mossop and Crane's establishment, where Mr. Mossop received him among the quiet dignity of his trade. The funeral director's pale hands moved with practiced precision as he demonstrated the exact location where the envelope had been concealed. Pinned to the underside of the pole, Inspector. 7 inches from the head end, secured with this. He produced a dressmaker's pin topped with what appeared to be mother of pearl, but proved, upon closer inspection, to be skillfully painted glass. Found it on the floor when we folded the pole. Not one of ours. Attached to the pin was a single dark hair and a fragment of black thread, worried into a small knot with the persistence of nervous fingers. Purbright accepted these offerings with the reverence due to evidence that spoke of human frailty beneath social composure. Who had access to arrange the pall? The usual committee ladies, naturally. Mrs. Brace Girdle supervised the flowers with her customary authority. Mrs. Whitmore made 2 visits to adjust the draping, said the symmetry required her personal attention. At one point, she was alone with the coffin, while I attended to a collapsed trestle. The Royal George Hotel, when Purbright arrived there shortly before noon, was conducting its morning business with the quiet efficiency that marked respectable establishments. Miss Diana Carmichael awaited him in the residence lounge, a woman whose poise suggested considerable experience in managing delicate conversations. She was, he observed, precisely as Hargreaves had described. Dark-haired, expensively dressed, and wearing that deep crimson lipstick which had featured so prominently in recent discussions. Her manner combined frankness with careful discretion, the hallmark of someone accustomed to navigating complex professional relationships. "Inspector Purbright," she said, offering her hand with practiced grace, "I believe my presence at yesterday's funeral may have occasioned some comment. Your relationship with the deceased Miss Carmichael? We were business associates. I represent a London firm exploring opportunities for expanding provincial drapers into more fashionable merchandise. Cedric and I had been discussing the possibility of bringing continental styles to Flaxborough. The careful phrasing suggested layers of meaning that Purbright filed away for future consideration. These discussions were conducted how frequently? Monthly visits usually. Sometimes more often when particular matters required personal attention. Her pause was brief but significant. I confess that what began as a purely commercial relationship developed complications of a personal nature. Mr. Whitmore's feelings extended beyond business. Indeed. During my last visit, a fortnight ago, he made it clear that his interests had become rather more than professional. I found it necessary to clarify that while I valued his friendship, my objectives remained strictly commercial. A difficult conversation, I imagine. More difficult than anticipated, Inspector. Cedric took my position rather badly. Accused me of encouraging his affections for business advantage. Quite unfair, really, though his disappointment was understandable. Miss Carmichael's account proceeded with the measured frankness of someone who had given considerable thought to the presentation of facts. She described Mr. Whitmore's emotional reaction to her rejection, his accusations of manipulation, and her own regret at the harsh words that had marked their final meeting. He became quite overwrought about my decision to terminate our association. Said things that were inappropriate for a married man to say to a business acquaintance. I left rather abruptly, without the usual courtesies. This meeting took place where? At his shop after hours. Cedric had suggested we might discuss matters privately, away from staff and customers. It seemed reasonable at the time. As their conversation concluded, Purbright found himself with a clearer picture of the emotional currents that had been flowing beneath Mr. Whitmore's apparently placid existence. Miss Carmichael's account, while carefully presented, revealed the sort of romantic entanglement that might well contribute to the stress affecting a middle-aged man's heart. His final call of the morning was upon Mrs. Whitmore herself, whom he found in the office behind Whitmore & Sons, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence with the composed efficiency of a woman managing the transition from wife to widow with practiced skill. "Inspector," she said, looking up from a column of figures that appeared to require her complete attention. "I wondered when you might call." "A few courteous questions, Mrs. Whitmore. Nothing to disturb your arrangements." "Arrangements have a consoling quality," she replied with a slight smile. "They obey instructions." Purbright's inquiries proceeded with his customary gentleness, touching upon her knowledge of Miss Carmichael, her husband's Thursday evening habits, and her own movements during the funeral preparations. Throughout, Mrs. Whitmore maintained the sort of controlled composure that suggested either remarkable self-possession or careful rehearsal. "Miss Carmichael mentioned business discussions with your husband." Cedric disliked London acquaintances, Inspector. Found their noise depressing, though he did mention some nonsense about expanding into fashion. I told him Flaxborough was perfectly content with its present arrangements. As he prepared to leave, Purbright's attention was caught by the ledger open upon her desk. One page showed a precisely cut rectangle where entries had been removed with the neatness of someone skilled in domestic economy. The bookmark, a strip of brown paper, bore a faint smudge of coral lipstick like the ghost of a kiss. "Your husband's bookkeeping was meticulous," he observed. "I've always insisted upon proper records, Inspector. Columns should balance, and accounts should close." Walking back through Market Square, Purbright reflected upon the morning's accumulation of evidence, the bitter powder in the envelope, Miss Carmichael's emotional rejection of Mr. Whitmore, the widow's suspicious composure, and the physical traces that spoke of concealed meetings and carefully managed appearances, all combined to suggest that the draper's death, while medically unremarkable, had occurred within a web of relationships more complex than Flaxborough's placid surface might suggest. In his office drawer, alongside the chemist's envelope and the dressmaker's pin, he placed Miss Carmichael's umbrella and added to his notes: business rejection, emotional stress, missing ledger entries, coral lipstick, Thursday evenings. Then, because thoroughness was his professional habit, he underlined Thursday evenings twice and settled back to consider what patterns might emerge from the accumulating evidence of human frailty beneath respectable appearances. The morning following his productive interviews brought Inspector Purbright face-to-face with Councillor Haxby in circumstances that suggested Flaxborough's official machinery had begun to take notice of developments at the funeral. The councillor had positioned himself in the inspector's office with the territorial confidence of a man accustomed to having his concerns addressed promptly, his black armband riding slightly higher on his sleeve as though eager to escape its duties. "Inspector, the matter of poor Whitmore's send-off has occasioned considerable discussion among responsible citizens," Haxby began, arranging his expression for public sorrow, while his eyes conveyed private caution. There's a general feeling that certain irregularities require swift resolution to preserve the town's reputation. Purbright received this intelligence with the patient courtesy he extended to all of Flaxborough's self-appointed guardians of public order, recognizing that civic anxieties often arrived wearing their Sunday clothes and speaking in euphemisms. What specific irregularities concern the committee, councillor? The business with the lipstick marks, naturally. Most unseemly for a funeral, and suggesting activities that reflect poorly upon our commercial standing. If word reaches the county offices that Flaxborough's shopkeepers are conducting themselves improperly. The councillor's voice carried the practiced timing of a man who understood that unfinished threats often weighed more heavily than completed ones. Your recommendation? A swift conclusion, Inspector. Something that restores public confidence without drawing unwanted attention. Perhaps the London woman's rejection led to an unfortunate scene that overtaxed the poor man's heart. These things happen when emotions run high, particularly with outsiders who don't understand our ways. After Haxby's departure, Purbright found himself considering the delicate balance between official expectations and investigative thoroughness. The councillor's preference for Miss Carmichael as the convenient explanation would satisfy social propriety while avoiding the sort of domestic scandal that might prove more troublesome to local sensibilities. His contemplation was interrupted by Mr. Sprott, the parish hall caretaker, who appeared with the wary courtesy of a man who had polished more memorial plates than his constitution might recommend. From a drawer dedicated to string of uncertain pedigree, he produced a notebook in which he recorded comings and goings with the precision of a meteorologist tracking weather patterns. 9:22. Mrs. Bracegirdle arrives with flowers and instructions, he read, with the satisfaction of a man whose observations had proved significant. 10:05. Lady in black asks for quiet look, says she's a cousin by marriage. Left before I could verify cousin with the widow. Description of this cousin? City sort, Inspector. Gloves with pearl buttons and a scent like expensive sweets that had been told not to be too cheerful. She moved the pall cloth, said it hung crooked and would give offence. Left a pin on the trestle, which I put by for safety. The pin matched Mr. Mossop's discovery, a white-headed affair that had once aspired to pearl status without quite achieving it. Purbright turned it between his fingers, imagining the nervous energy with which it had been jabbed into velvet by someone whose composure required physical outlet. You mentioned this cousin to Mrs. Whitmore? She said relations were apt to appear at funerals and should be given their head for the duration. I understood that to mean the less said, the sooner finished. From the parish hall, Purbright made his way to Whitmore and Sons, where he found Miss Valerie Pert arranging black ties in the window display with movements that suggested considerable internal agitation. Her usual professional composure had been replaced by the nervous determination of someone who had spent sleepless hours deciding whether propriety permitted the sharing of uncomfortable observations. Inspector, there are matters about Mr. Whitmore's recent behavior that perhaps should be mentioned, she began, her voice carrying the careful precision of rehearsed revelation. Things that seemed merely peculiar at the time, but now appear rather more significant. Her account, delivered with increasing confidence as she proceeded, revealed aspects of her employer's final weeks that cast his death in a different light entirely. The Thursday evening routine had changed from methodical bookkeeping to locked doors and whispered telephone conversations. Special orders had appeared for expensive merchandise quite outside their usual inventory. Silk scarves, French perfumes, jewelry more appropriate for a fashionable boutique than a provincial draper's establishment. The invoices were marked personal account, which struck me as irregular for business transactions, and there was that small notebook he began carrying in his waistcoat pocket, consulting it frequently, guarding it like valuable correspondence. This notebook disappeared. Mrs. Whitmore collected his personal effects the morning after the funeral. Spent considerable time in his office, though she claimed to be merely gathering papers for the solicitor. The notebook was certainly present during his final day at the shop. Purbright's next call was upon Dr. Malley, whom he found reviewing the medical aspects of Mr. Whitmore's demise with the thoroughness of a professional whose reputation depended upon accurate diagnosis. The doctor's manner suggested that recent developments had prompted reconsideration of details that had seemed unremarkable at the time of death. The heart failure was genuine, Inspector, though certain symptoms now strike me as requiring additional consideration. Whitmore had been complaining of digestive troubles, nausea after meals, persistent bitter taste, unusual fatigue, occasional dizzy spells. At the time, I attributed them to business stress, but given recent revelations, Dr. Malley's pause carried the weight of professional concern about potentially missed diagnoses. His examination of notes revealed a pattern that, while consistent with heart disease, might also suggest other possibilities requiring more careful investigation. The bitter taste particularly troubles me in retrospect. Combined with the digestive distress and fatigue, it presents symptoms that could indicate various conditions capable of stressing the heart beyond its natural capacity. The doctor's careful phrasing conveyed implications that professional discretion prevented him from stating more directly, though Purbright understood perfectly the medical possibilities being suggested with such diplomatic circumspection. His final appointment brought him back to Mrs. Whitmore, whom he found in the office behind Whitmore and Sons, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence with the composed efficiency of a woman managing transition from wife to widow with practiced skill. The ledger lay open upon her desk, displaying that precisely cut rectangle where entries had been removed with surgical neatness. "Inspector," she said, looking up from columns of figures that appeared to require her complete attention, "I wondered when you might call again. A few additional questions. Mrs. Whitmore, nothing to disturb your arrangements unduly." "Arrangements have a consoling quality, Inspector. They respond to instruction with such reliability." Purbright's inquiries proceeded with customary gentleness, touching upon the missing notebook, her husband's Thursday evening activities, and the special orders that Miss Pert had mentioned. Throughout, Mrs. Whitmore maintained controlled composure that suggested either remarkable self-possession or careful preparation for precisely such conversations. Miss Pert mentioned certain expensive purchases that seemed outside your usual business requirements. Cedric occasionally indulged in what he called improving the establishment's tone. I told him Flaxborough was perfectly content with its present arrangements, but men sometimes develop peculiar notions about commerce. Her hand drifted unconsciously toward the missing pages in the ledger, a gesture that spoke more eloquently than words about the careful editing that had taken place in the aftermath of her husband's death. These improvements were recorded in the usual manner. Cedric was meticulous about records, Inspector, though one does find, in reviewing old accounts, that certain entries become redundant over time, or perhaps simply less relevant to ongoing operations. As he prepared to leave, Purbright's attention lingered on the brown paper bookmark that bore its faint coral smudge, a ghost of a kiss that seemed to mock the careful respectability of the widow's explanations. Walking back through Market Square, Purbright reflected upon the day's accumulation of evidence. The mysterious cousin who had adjusted the pall, the missing notebook that had contained Mr. Whitmore's private business, the medical symptoms that suggested more than natural heart failure, and the carefully edited ledger that spoke of deliberate concealment, all combined to create a picture considerably more complex than Councillor Haxby's preferred narrative of romantic disappointment and natural consequences. In his office drawer, alongside the growing collection of physical evidence, he placed his notes about the cousin's visit, the missing financial records, and Dr. Malley's medical concerns. Then, because thoroughness was his professional habit, he wrote, "Advance preparations." medical symptoms, financial concealment, mysterious cousin, and underlined advanced preparations twice, recognizing that in cases of domestic complexity, the most significant evidence often lay in the careful planning that preceded apparently spontaneous events. The death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore was revealing layers of deception that extended far beyond simple romantic entanglement, involving the sort of methodical preparation that suggested motives more calculated than passion and methods more deliberate than emotional confrontation. Inspector Purbright's habit, when a case began to reveal the faintest outline of deliberate intention beneath its surface, was to revisit the most ordinary aspects and examine what everyone else believed had been satisfactorily explained. Thus, before the Morning Post arrived, he found himself back at the parish hall with Mr. Sprott, where the green baize pall lay spread across a trestle like evidence awaiting judgment. "Same pall we always use for the heavy occasions, Inspector," Sprott assured him, smoothing the fabric with proprietary care. "You can tell by the weight of the fringe and this chalk mark here. Mr. Mossop puts 'top' on the head end to prevent arguments among the bereaved." Purbright examined the faint chalk marking, noting how it had been positioned during yesterday's ceremony. "The pall was adjusted during the service, I understand. Twice, as it happens. Mrs. Whitmore didn't care for how the light caught the weave. Said it showed every crease like an unironed shroud. We turned it after that London lady made her adjustments, then again when Mr. Mossop's trestle gave way and caused a general commotion." The inspector's attention focused on a small scorch mark near one corner, examining the surrounding fabric with unhurried thoroughness. Caught in the stitching, he discovered a short white fiber and, more significantly, the faintest trace of something that glittered when held to the light, a microscopic residue that suggested cosmetic powder containing the sort of metallic dust that gave certain lipsticks their lustrous quality. The envelope Mr. Mossop found it was positioned where, when you folded the pall. Under what had become the head end after all the turning about, Inspector? Though if it had been pinned when top still meant the top, it would have ended up at the foot. Makes one wonder about timing, doesn't it? From the parish hall, Purbright proceeded to his morning appointments with the methodical thoroughness that marked his investigative approach. Mrs. Bracegirdle awaited him at the station with the purposeful determination of a woman who had spent considerable time organizing disturbing observations into presentable form. "Inspector, I have given proper thought to yesterday's funeral arrangements, and certain irregularities require official attention," she announced, producing from her basket a glass jar that appeared to contain ordinary baking powder, though her manner suggested contents of considerably greater significance. This was discovered among the refreshment supplies in the parish hall kitchen. Not our usual brand, Inspector, and bearing a rather distinctive odor that reminded me of the bitter almond essence we reserve for Christmas cakes. Most irregular, as our committee ladies are particular about using familiar ingredients for public consumption. The jar bore a chemist's label from a London establishment quite outside Flaxborough's usual commercial connections. Purbright noted the faint but unmistakable scent that Mrs. Bracegirdle had detected, a bitter quality that seemed to linger despite the container being sealed. The powder was positioned behind our proper supplies, as though someone wished it to remain unnoticed until needed. None of our regular ladies had purchased or placed it there, leading to the uncomfortable conclusion that someone gained unauthorized access to our kitchen stores. Mrs. Bracegirdle's account revealed that the mysterious substance had appeared sometime between the committee's last meeting and yesterday's funeral, suggesting deliberate placement by someone familiar with the hall's layout and the committee's preparation routines. After her departure, Purbright made his way to the offices of Messrs. Crankshaw and Bowles, solicitors, where Mr. Bowles received him with the careful attention that marked professional men who understood the delicate relationship between legal propriety and social stability. Recent developments had clearly prompted reconsideration of arrangements that had seemed perfectly routine at their creation. The will itself follows conventional patterns, Inspector, everything to the widow as expected. However, certain codicils added recently now appear rather more significant than they seemed during our original discussions. Mr. Bowles produced documents revealing Mr. Whitmore's growing anxiety about business complications that might affect his estate's value. Specific provisions had been made for rapid liquidation of particular assets, settlement of certain debts, and destruction of correspondence he described as commercially sensitive but personally embarrassing. He seemed particularly concerned about papers that might be misunderstood by those unfamiliar with modern business practices. Mentioned London associates who conducted affairs in ways that provincial minds might find irregular, though perfectly legitimate in commercial terms. The codicils had been witnessed during Miss Carmichael's final visit to Flaxborough, a detail that required careful consideration given the emotional circumstances she had described during their previous conversation. Mr. Whitmore's state of mind during the signing struck me as notably agitated, Inspector. He spoke repeatedly about protecting his wife from complications that might arise from his business relationships, seeming convinced that certain arrangements required immediate documentation to prevent future difficulties. From the solicitor's office, Purbright visited the railway station, where the station master's methodical memory revealed a pattern of Thursday evening collections that cast Mr. Whitmore's regular habits in a different light entirely. Heavy parcels marked private and confidential had arrived with clockwork regularity, wrapped in distinctive dark green paper and collected personally by the deceased. Punctual as the evening train, Mr. Whitmore was, the station master recalled, polishing brass fittings with practiced efficiency. Never missed a Thursday collection. Said it was materials for his hobby, though what hobby required such regular, substantial deliveries remained his private business. At Salon B, Mrs. Dabb received Purbright among her mirrors and cosmetic displays with the gravity she reserved for matters affecting Flaxborough's standards of appearance. Her professional expertise proved invaluable in identifying the subtle traces he had discovered. The coral shade favored by Mrs. Whitmore is our sea holly, she explained, indicating a lipstick that contained the faintest dusting of metallic particles for what she termed lift. Rather bold for funeral occasions in less assured hands. The deeper red worn by the London lady was clearly passion red, a chemist's formulation with considerably more dramatic intentions. Mrs. Dabb's records revealed that only 2 customers had recently purchased sea holly, Mrs. Whitmore herself and Miss Peart from the draper's shop, who had declared herself tired of looking like a nurse and desired something more becoming. As evening settled over Flaxborough with its customary punctuality, Purbright returned to his office to arrange the day's discoveries alongside his growing collection of evidence. The suspicious powder found in the parish hall kitchen, the carefully timed placement of the envelope beneath the pall, the financial arrangements that suggested secret complications, and the pattern of Thursday deliveries that coincided with Mr. Whitmore's worsening symptoms all combined to create a picture of methodical preparation that extended far beyond spontaneous grief or romantic disappointment. In his drawer, alongside the physical evidence that spoke of deliberate planning and careful concealment, he placed his notes about the mysterious powder, the witnessed codicils, and the regular deliveries that had marked the deceased's final months. Then, because thoroughness was his professional habit, he wrote, systematic preparation. Timed evidence placement, financial complications, regular deliveries, and underlined systematic preparation twice, recognizing that in cases involving such methodical planning, the most significant evidence often lay not in dramatic revelations, but in the careful accumulation of seemingly innocent details that revealed their true significance only when viewed as components of a larger design. The death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore was revealing itself as considerably more complex than natural causes. involving the sort of patient, systematic approach that required both intimate knowledge of the deceased's habits and considerable advance planning to execute successfully. Someone had been thinking very carefully indeed about how events might unfold once gravity and human nature took their respective shares of the proceedings. Inspector Purbright's habit, when a case began to reveal the faintest outline of deliberate intention beneath its surface, was to revisit the most ordinary aspects and examine what everyone else believed had been satisfactorily explained. Thus, before the Morning Post arrived, he found himself back at the parish hall with Mr. Sprott, where the green baize pall lay spread across a trestle like evidence awaiting judgment. "Same pall we always use for the heavy occasions, Inspector," Sprott assured him, smoothing the fabric with proprietary care. "You can tell by the weight of the fringe and this chalk mark here. Mr. Mossop puts top on the head end to prevent arguments among the bereaved." Purbright examined the faint chalk marking, noting how it had been positioned during yesterday's ceremony. "The pall was adjusted during the service, I understand." "Twice, as it happens. Mrs. Whitmore didn't care for how the light caught the weave. Said it showed every crease like an unironed shroud. We turned it after that London lady made her adjustments, then again when Mr. Mossop's trestle gave way and caused a general commotion." The inspector's attention focused on a small scorch mark near one corner, examining the surrounding fabric with unhurried thoroughness. Caught in the stitching, he discovered a short white fiber and, more significantly, the faintest trace of something that glittered when held to the light. A microscopic residue that suggested cosmetic powder containing the sort of metallic dust that gave certain lipsticks their lustrous quality. "The envelope, Mr. Mossop found. It was positioned where when you folded the pall. Under what had become the head end after all the turning about, Inspector. Though if it had been pinned when top still meant the top, it would have ended up at the foot. Makes one wonder about timing, doesn't it?" From the parish hall, Purbright proceeded to his morning appointments with the methodical thoroughness that marked his investigative approach. Mrs. Bracegirdle awaited him at the station with the purposeful determination of a woman who had spent considerable time organizing disturbing observations into presentable form. "Inspector, I've given proper thought to yesterday's funeral arrangements, and certain irregularities require official attention," she announced, producing from her basket a glass jar that appeared to contain ordinary baking powder, though her manner suggested contents of considerably greater significance. This was discovered among the refreshment supplies in the parish hall kitchen. Not our usual brand, Inspector, and bearing a rather distinctive odor that reminded me of the bitter almond essence we reserve for Christmas cakes. Most irregular, as our committee ladies are particular about using familiar ingredients for public consumption. The jar bore a chemist's label from a London establishment quite outside Flaxborough's usual commercial connections. Purbright noted the faint but unmistakable scent that Mrs. Bracegirdle had detected, a bitter quality that seemed to linger despite the container being sealed. The powder was positioned behind our proper supplies, as though someone wished it to remain unnoticed until needed. None of our regular ladies had purchased or placed it there, leading to the uncomfortable conclusion that someone gained unauthorized access to our kitchen stores. Mrs. Bracegirdle's account revealed that the mysterious substance had appeared sometime between the committee's last meeting and yesterday's funeral, suggesting deliberate placement by someone familiar with the hall's layout and the committee's preparation routines. After her departure, Purbright made his way to the offices of Messrs. Crankshaw and Bowles, solicitors, where Mr. Bowles received him with the careful attention that marked professional men who understood the delicate relationship between legal propriety and social stability. Recent developments had clearly prompted reconsideration of arrangements that had seemed perfectly routine at their creation. The will itself follows conventional patterns, Inspector, everything to the widow as expected. However, certain codicils added recently now appear rather more significant than they seemed during our original discussions. Mr. Bowles produced documents revealing Mr.'s Whitmore's growing anxiety about business complications that might affect his estate's value. Specific provisions had been made for rapid liquidation of particular assets, settlement of certain debts, and destruction of correspondence he described as commercially sensitive but personally embarrassing. He seemed particularly concerned about papers that might be misunderstood by those unfamiliar with modern business practices. Mentioned London associates who conducted affairs in ways that provincial minds might find irregular, though perfectly legitimate in commercial terms. The codicils had been witnessed during Miss Carmichael's final visit to Flaxborough, a detail that required careful consideration given the emotional circumstances she had described during their previous conversation. Mr. Whitmore's state of mind during the signing struck me as notably agitated, Inspector. He spoke repeatedly about protecting his wife from complications that might arise from his business relationships, seeming convinced that certain arrangements required immediate documentation to prevent future difficulties. From the solicitor's office, Purbright visited the railway station, where the station master's methodical memory revealed a pattern of Thursday evening collections that cast Mr. Whitmore's regular habits in a different light entirely. Heavy parcels marked private and confidential had arrived with clockwork regularity, wrapped in distinctive dark green paper and collected personally by the deceased. Punctual as the evening train, Mr. Whitmore was, the station master recalled, polishing brass fittings with practiced efficiency. Never missed a Thursday collection. Said it was materials for his hobby, though what hobby required such regular, substantial deliveries remained his private business. At Salon B, Mrs. Dabb received Purbright among her mirrors and cosmetic displays, with the gravity she reserved for matters affecting Flaxborough's standards of appearance. Her professional expertise proved invaluable in identifying the subtle traces he had discovered. The coral shade favored by Mrs. Whitmore is our sea holly, she explained, indicating a lipstick that contained the faintest dusting of metallic particles for what she termed lift. Rather bold for funeral occasions in less assured hands. The deeper red worn by the London lady was clearly passion red, a chemist's formulation with considerably more dramatic intentions. Mrs. Dabb's records revealed that only 2 customers had recently purchased sea holly. Mrs. Whitmore herself and Miss Pert from the draper's shop, who had declared herself tired of looking like a nurse and desired something more becoming. As evening settled over Flaxborough with its customary punctuality, Purbright returned to his office to arrange the day's discoveries alongside his growing collection of evidence. The suspicious powder found in the parish hall kitchen, the carefully timed placement of the envelope beneath the pall, the financial arrangements that suggested secret complications, and the pattern of Thursday deliveries that coincided with Mr. Whitmore's worsening symptoms, all combined to create a picture of methodical preparation that extended far beyond spontaneous grief or romantic disappointment. In his drawer, alongside the physical evidence that spoke of deliberate planning and careful concealment, he placed his notes about the mysterious powder, the witnessed codicils, and the regular deliveries that had marked the deceased's final months. Then, because thoroughness was his professional habit, he wrote, systematic preparation, timed evidence placement, financial complications, regular deliveries, and underlined systematic preparation twice, recognizing that in cases involving such methodical planning, the most significant evidence often lay not in dramatic revelations, but in the careful accumulation of seemingly innocent details that revealed their true significance only when viewed as components of a larger design. The death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore was revealing itself as considerably more complex than natural causes, involving the sort of patient, systematic approach that required both intimate knowledge of the deceased's habits and considerable advance planning to execute successfully. Someone had been thinking very carefully indeed about how events might unfold once gravity and human nature took their respective shares of the proceedings. the morning after his discovery of the systematic preparation underlying Mr. Whitmore's funeral arrangements brought Inspector Purbright to the Flaxborough Provident Bank, where Mr. Finch received him with the careful courtesy that financial institutions reserved for official inquiries. The manager's office smelled of leather-bound ledgers and the particular anxiety that accompanied unexpected scrutiny of confidential records. Mr. Whitmore's banking arrangements were, until recently, models of provincial predictability, Mr. Finch explained, adjusting his spectacles with the precision of a man whose life was measured in balanced columns. However, the past 6 months revealed a rather more adventurous approach to commerce than his public reputation might suggest. The ledger entries told a story of increasing financial complexity that seemed quite outside the character of Flaxborough's most conservative draper. Regular Thursday withdrawals had grown from modest amounts to substantial sums, all collected in cash, despite Mr. Whitmore's usual preference for the security of written transactions. He spoke of a business partnership that would revolutionize retail opportunities in the provinces, Mr. Finch continued, his tone suggesting professional skepticism about such grandiose claims. The arrangements required considerable initial investment, though he remained remarkably secretive about the precise nature of the venture. More significantly, the bank records revealed payments to a London firm styled Meridian Commercial Consultants, regular monthly transfers that coincided precisely with the mysterious Thursday deliveries. Mr. Whitmore had also inquired about securing a substantial loan against his business, citing expansion opportunities that required immediate capital investment. His manner during these discussions struck me as notably agitated, Inspector. He spoke of time pressures and the importance of maintaining confidentiality until contracts were finalized. Most unlike his usual methodical approach to financial matters, from the bank's revelations about hidden financial arrangements, Purbright proceeded to the railway station, where the station master's cooperation had yielded the uncollected parcel that had arrived after Mr. Whitmore's death. The package lay on his desk like evidence awaiting judgment, its dark green wrapping bearing the same London postmark that had marked the deceased's weekly collections. Still sealed, Inspector, though the weight suggests contents more substantial than the haberdashery samples claimed on the label, the station master observed with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had proved warranted. The sender has made no inquiry about non-delivery, which strikes me as irregular for legitimate commercial correspondence. Purbright examined the package without opening it, noting the quality of the wrapping paper and the careful attention to postal regulations that suggested someone familiar with shipping valuable or sensitive materials. The return address, Meridian Commercial Consultants, Clerkenwell, matched the bank records exactly, confirming the connection between the financial arrangements and the mysterious deliveries. His next call brought him to Dr. Malley's surgery, where the physician awaited him with the troubled expression of a man whose professional certainty had begun to waver under the weight of accumulating evidence. The doctor's consultation room bore the comfortable authority of medical practice, though recent developments had clearly disturbed its usual calm. Inspector, I have spent considerable time reviewing Mr. Whitmore's symptoms in light of yesterday's discoveries, and certain aspects of his condition now require more careful consideration, Dr. Malley began, his hands moving restlessly among the papers on his desk. The progression of his complaints, digestive distress, persistent bitter taste, unusual fatigue, cardiac irregularities, forms a pattern that medical literature associates with various forms of systematic physical stress. The doctor's careful phrasing conveyed implications that professional discretion prevented him from stating more directly, though Purbright understood perfectly the medical possibilities being suggested with such diplomatic circumspection. The Thursday evening pattern of worsening symptoms is particularly significant, Inspector. Combined with the discovery of suspicious substances and the evidence of regular deliveries, we may be looking at a case that requires considerably more thorough investigation than natural causes would warrant. Dr. Malley's growing concerns about the medical aspects of Mr. Whitmore's death added scientific weight to the circumstantial evidence that had been accumulating since the funeral. The systematic nature of the symptoms suggested someone with both medical knowledge and intimate access to the victim's daily routine. At the Royal George Hotel, Mrs. Pocklington received Purbright with the brisk efficiency she brought to all matters affecting her establishment's reputation. Her residence lounge bore the comfortable authority of provincial hospitality, though recent events had clearly introduced complications to its usual calm. "Miss Carmichael conducts herself with perfect propriety, Inspector," she announced, arranging tea service with practiced precision. "Keeps regular hours, pays promptly, and maintains the sort of discretion one expects from London visitors. However, certain recent developments have occasioned some concern about the nature of her business in Flaxborough." Mrs. Pocklington's observations revealed that Miss Carmichael had received several telephone calls of unusual duration, conducted in the sort of hushed tones that suggested matters of considerable delicacy. A visitor had also called the previous evening, Mr. Jevons from the Citizen, though their conversation had been brief and apparently unsatisfactory to both parties. "She requested bicarbonate after dinner, Inspector, claiming digestive distress from the day's emotional strain. When I mentioned that our preparations were of standard strength and not suitable for experimentation, she laughed in a manner that suggested considerable familiarity with such substances." The hotel's atmosphere of genteel respectability had been subtly disturbed by undercurrents of tension that spoke of secrets carefully maintained beneath the surface of social propriety. From the Royal George, Purbright made his way to Hargreaves and Son, where Mr. Hargreaves awaited him with additional intelligence about the cosmetic purchases that had featured so prominently in recent discussions. The chemist's professional records revealed patterns of acquisition that cast the lipstick evidence in a more complex light. 3 purchases of passion red within the past month, Inspector," Hargreaves reported, consulting his sales ledger with practiced efficiency. Miss Carmichael's acquisition was the second. The first was made by a gentleman caller who declined to provide his name, paying in cash and requesting discretion about the transaction. The third was purchased by Mr. Jevons of the Citizen, who inquired specifically about permanence and resistance to removal. The revelation that multiple parties had acquired the distinctive crimson shade suggested a level of coordination that extended beyond coincidence, involving individuals whose public roles in Flaxborough's social machinery provided perfect cover for more complex private activities. As evening settled over the town with its customary punctuality, Purbright returned to his office to arrange the day's discoveries alongside his growing collection of evidence. The financial records that revealed hidden business arrangements, the uncollected parcel that suggested ongoing complications, the medical concerns that pointed toward systematic intervention, and the coordinated acquisition of specific cosmetic materials, all combined to create a picture of methodical planning that involved multiple participants working toward carefully orchestrated objective. In his drawer, alongside the physical evidence that spoke of deliberate preparation and careful concealment, he placed his notes about the London business connection, the coordinated lipstick purchases, and the medical pattern that suggested systematic rather than natural causes. Then, because thoroughness was his professional habit, he wrote, "Multiple participants, coordinated planning, financial deception, medical intervention," and underlined multiple participants twice, recognizing that the death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore was revealing itself as considerably more complex than a simple case of romantic disappointment or business rivalry. The case was developing the sort of intricate social dynamics that made Flaxborough's apparently placid surface infinitely more interesting than casual observation might suggest, involving a web of relationships and motives that extended far beyond the obvious suspects and into the carefully maintained respectability that governed the town's public life. Someone had indeed been thinking very carefully about how events might unfold, but the planning had involved more minds than one, working in coordination to achieve objectives that remained tantalizingly just beyond the reach of complete understanding. The morning following Inspector Purbright's discovery of the coordinated lipstick purchases brought him face to face with the uncollected parcel from Meridian Commercial Consultants, which lay upon his desk with the patient dignity of evidence that had been waiting to reveal its secrets. The brown paper wrapping bore the same careful attention to postal regulations that had marked Mr. Whitmore's weekly collections, though its abandonment suggested that recent events had disrupted more than funeral arrangements. Sergeant Malley assisted with the methodical unwrapping that Purbright's thoroughness demanded, revealing contents that cast the deceased draper's hobby in a considerably different light than haberdashery samples might suggest. Nestled within protective wadding were 17 small glass vials, each bearing chemist's labels written in the precise notation of someone familiar with pharmaceutical terminology, though the substances themselves bore little resemblance to the digestive remedies claimed on the shipping manifest. The accompanying documentation, written in a careful hand that suggested scientific training, provided detailed instructions for the preparation and administration of what were euphemistically described as restorative tonics for commercial travelers experiencing provincial dietary challenges. The formulations bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the compounds Dr. Malley had mentioned in connection with Mr. Whitmore's symptoms, though the careful language employed suggested knowledge of both medical effects and legal boundaries. 17 preparations in total, Inspector, Sergeant Malley observed, arranging the vials with the methodical precision that marked his approach to evidence, each labeled with codes rather than standard pharmaceutical names and accompanied by instructions that read more like recipes than medical prescriptions. One vial, notably, contained a bitter white powder that matched precisely the mysterious substance Mrs. Bracegirdle had discovered in the parish hall kitchen. Another held a crystalline preparation that, when examined closely, bore the faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds, a detail that would have interested Dr. Malley considerably had he been present to observe it. The discovery prompted an immediate reconsideration of Miss Carmichael's role in recent events. Her claims of a purely commercial relationship with Mr. Whitmore gained credibility when viewed against evidence of an actual business operation, though the nature of that business raised questions considerably more serious than romantic disappointment or fashion consultation. From his examination of the pharmaceutical evidence, Purbright proceeded to the Royal George Hotel, where Miss Carmichael received him with the composed attention of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had prepared accordingly. Her manner combined professional courtesy with the subtle tension of a person whose carefully maintained explanations were about to face more rigorous scrutiny. "Inspector, I believe the contents of that parcel may have created misunderstandings about my relationship with Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice carrying the measured precision of someone who understood that partial truth might prove more convincing than complete fabrication. The arrangements were legitimate pharmaceutical consulting, though perhaps more specialized than provincial establishments typically require. Her account revealed that Meridian Commercial Consultants served a clientele of rural chemists and private physicians who required access to preparations not readily available through conventional suppliers. Mr. Whitmore's involvement had begun as a simple matter of providing secure storage and discreet distribution, though his emotional attachment to the business relationship had complicated what should have remained purely professional arrangements. Cedric's feelings for me were an unfortunate development that threatened the discretion our operation required. Miss Carmichael explained with the frankness of someone who recognized that circumstances had moved beyond careful euphemism. His wife's cooperation became necessary when his romantic expectations made direct business dealings increasingly difficult to maintain. The revelation that Mrs. Whitmore had been an active participant rather than an innocent widow cast the entire investigation in a different light, suggesting motivations considerably more complex than domestic jealousy or business disappointment. At Whitmore and Sons, Purbright found Mrs. Whitmore arranging the shop's affairs with the composed efficiency that had marked her approach to widowhood. Though recent, developments had clearly introduced complications to what should have been straightforward commercial transition. Her manner suggested someone who had given considerable thought to explaining arrangements that might appear irregular to official scrutiny. "Inspector, I confess that Cedric's business relationships extended beyond conventional drapery," she said, her hands moving among the ledgers with movements that spoke of careful preparation for this conversation. "The pharmaceutical consulting provided supplementary income that allowed us to maintain the shop during difficult periods, though the discretion it required made proper record-keeping rather more complex than usual." Her explanation proceeded with the measured frankness of someone who understood that cooperation might prove more advantageous than concealment. The missing notebook had contained details of the consulting arrangements, including client lists and preparation schedules that she had considered too sensitive to leave among the shop's regular business records. The Thursday evening deliveries were part of a monthly distribution cycle that served several rural establishments. She continued, producing from a locked drawer a small leather journal that bore the unmistakable signs of hasty concealment. Cedric became increasingly anxious about the arrangements during his final weeks, speaking of complications that made him wish to withdraw from activities he found morally troubling. The journal's contents revealed Mr. Whitmore's growing concerns about the true nature of the substances he was handling and the clientele they served. His careful script recorded observations about preparations that seemed designed for purposes quite different from the therapeutic claims made in the official documentation. The final entries suggest he had discovered something about our London partners that disturbed him considerably, Mrs. Whitmore admitted, her composure showing the first signs of strain. He spoke of wanting to end the association, though Miss Carmichael made it clear that withdrawal would not be easily accomplished. Dr. Malley, when presented with samples from the mysterious vials, confirmed Purbright's suspicions about their medical significance. The preparations included several compounds capable of producing the symptoms Mr. Whitmore had experienced, though their administration would require both medical knowledge and intimate access to the victim's daily routine. "The progression of symptoms suggests systematic exposure over several weeks, Inspector," the doctor explained with the careful precision that marked his professional assessments. Someone with considerable knowledge of both chemistry and human physiology had been conducting what might charitably be called experimental treatment. As evening settled over Flaxborough with its customary punctuality, Purbright found himself considering the complex web of relationships and motivations that had emerged from what had seemed a simple case of natural death. The pharmaceutical operation provided motives considerably more compelling than romantic disappointment, involving individuals whose respectable positions depended entirely on maintaining the secrecy of activities that extended well beyond the boundaries of legitimate commerce. The case was revealing itself as a masterpiece of provincial deception involving coordination between multiple parties who had used their positions in Flaxborough's social machinery to provide perfect cover for activities that required both intimate local knowledge and sophisticated understanding of legal boundaries. Mr. Whitmore's death had occurred not from heartbreak or business disappointment, but as the logical conclusion of a scheme that had grown beyond his moral comfort and threatened to expose activities that could destroy several carefully maintained reputations. In his office drawer, alongside the pharmaceutical evidence that spoke of systematic preparation and calculated administration, Purbright placed his notes about the coordinated deception that had involved not just the obvious suspects, but a network of individuals whose public respectability had provided ideal camouflage for considerably less respectable private activities. The death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore was beginning to reveal itself as the product of careful planning by minds that understood both human nature and the delicate balance between official scrutiny and social propriety that governed life in towns like Flaxborough, where the most dangerous secrets were often hidden behind the most respectable facades. The morning following Inspector Purbright's discovery of the pharmaceutical conspiracy brought him face to face with what would prove to be the second incident that shifted the investigation's comfortable trajectory toward more troubling possibilities. Mr. Hargreaves awaited him at the chemist's shop with the expression of a man who had discovered that professional discretion offered inadequate protection against determined intruders. "They took 3 pages from the sales ledger, Inspector," Hargreaves announced without preamble, gesturing toward his violated premises with the wounded dignity of a man whose faith in locks had been professionally challenged. "Not the cash drawer, mind you, nor even the fountain pen that belonged to my father. Just those particular records of recent cosmetic purchases and pharmaceutical consultations. The break-in had been executed with surgical precision that spoke of intimate knowledge rather than opportunistic theft. The back door showed no signs of forcing, suggesting access to keys that hung during business hours on a hook visible from the main counter. More significantly, the intruder had known exactly which records to remove, cutting the relevant pages with the neat efficiency of someone familiar with evidence management. A gentleman caller yesterday afternoon provided ample opportunity for reconnaissance. Hargreaves continued, producing from behind the counter a small object that glinted in the morning light. "While I demonstrated the historical uses of smelling salts, someone with steady nerves could have observed our security arrangements. Left this behind in their haste." The glove button bore the lustrous quality of mother of pearl, though closer inspection revealed it to be skillfully painted glass. A fragment of black thread remained attached, along with the faintest smudge of coral lipstick that would have interested Mrs. Dabb considerably had she been present to examine it. From Hargreaves, Purbright proceeded to interview Mr. Jevons, whom he found at the citizen offices with the wary courtesy of a journalist who had begun to suspect that his recent inquiries might have attracted more official attention than comfortable. The newspaper man's explanation for his lipstick purchase carried the careful precision of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for precisely such questions. "Professional curiosity, Inspector," Jevons explained, adjusting his spectacles with the ritual precision that preceded his more creative explanations. The durability claims of modern cosmetics seemed worthy of investigative journalism. One must occasionally test commercial assertions in the cause of public service. Did Councillor Haxby suggest such an article? He mentioned, in his expansive way, that London influence tend to leave permanent stains on provincial establishments. I had observed as much independently. Jevons paused, then added with the shrewd observation that marked his better reporting. If someone wishes Miss Carmichael to be thought guilty of coffin kissing, that person understands the value of misdirection. The journalist's insights proved more valuable than his explanations. His trained eye for social dynamics had recognized immediately that the funeral arrangements contained elements of deliberate theater, designed to direct attention toward romantic complications while concealing evidence of more serious criminal activity. At Whitmore and Sons, Mrs. Whitmore received Purbright with the composed efficiency that had marked her transition from wife to widow, though recent developments had clearly introduced complications to what should have been straightforward commercial arrangements. The shop's atmosphere bore subtle signs of disturbance, drawers that had been searched and carefully restored, filing cabinets that showed evidence of recent attention. "I've had visitors expressing interest in my late husband's business records," she admitted with the frankness of someone who recognized that cooperation might prove more advantageous than concealment. A gentleman with expensive hair oil in the manner of someone accustomed to having requests fulfilled without discussion. Her account revealed that pressure had been applied through channels both subtle and direct, suggesting that the pharmaceutical operation involved parties whose investment extended well beyond Flaxborough's boundaries. The missing pages from her husband's journal had contained client lists and distribution schedules that someone considered worth considerable risk to obtain. Cedric's growing reluctance to continue the arrangements had created complications that extended beyond our local concerns, she explained, her hands moving among the ledgers with movements that spoke of careful editing. The Thursday deliveries were part of a network that served establishments throughout the rural districts, involving financial commitments that did not accommodate individual withdrawal. Dr. Malley's further examination of the pharmaceutical samples confirmed Purbright's suspicions about their medical significance. The compounds included several preparations capable of producing the symptoms Mr. Whitmore had experienced, though their administration would require both sophisticated knowledge and intimate access to the victim's daily routine. The progression suggests systematic exposure over several weeks, Inspector, the doctor explained with professional precision. Someone with considerable understanding of both chemistry and human physiology had been conducting what might charitably be termed experimental treatment, designed to simulate natural cardiac failure while avoiding detection through conventional examination. As evening settled over Flaxborough with its customary punctuality, Purbright found himself considering the complex web of relationships and motivations that the break-in had revealed. The pharmaceutical operation had involved coordination between multiple parties whose respectable positions provided perfect camouflage for activities that extended well beyond legitimate commerce. Mr. Whitmore's death had occurred not from heartbreak or business disappointment, but as the logical conclusion of a scheme that had grown beyond his moral comfort and threatened to expose a network of considerable sophistication and reach. The second incident had accomplished precisely what such developments typically achieved in well-organized investigations. It had shifted suspicion away from convenient explanations toward more troubling possibilities that involved intimate knowledge of local arrangements and systematic planning by minds that understood both human nature and the delicate balance between official scrutiny and social propriety. In his office drawer, alongside the accumulating evidence that spoke of deliberate preparation and calculated administration, Purbright placed his notes about the coordinated break-in, the missing client records, and the pressure being applied to eliminate evidence of activities that had required both local knowledge and sophisticated criminal organization. Then, because thoroughness was his professional habit, he wrote, "Network operation. Systematic elimination, local knowledge, external pressure," and underlined external pressure twice, recognizing that the death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore was revealing itself as merely one component of a considerably larger enterprise that extended far beyond the boundaries of Flaxborough's apparently placid surface. The case was developing the sort of intricate complications that made provincial mysteries infinitely more dangerous than their modest settings might suggest, involving minds that understood perfectly how to exploit the respectability and social connections that governed small-town life, for purposes that would have horrified the very people whose trust they had so carefully cultivated. Inspector Purbright's evening contemplations had acquired the methodical quality of a man arranging evidence like pieces in a particularly complex jigsaw puzzle, where the picture on the box bore little resemblance to the emerging image. He sat in his office as darkness settled over Flaxborough with its customary punctuality. The day's discoveries spread before him with the careful precision of a pharmacist measuring compounds, a comparison that recent events had made uncomfortably apt. The break-in at Hargreaves & Son had accomplished more than the mere theft of incriminating records. It had revealed the systematic nature of the deception that had surrounded Mr. Whitmore's death. Someone had anticipated the possibility of official investigation and prepared accordingly, demonstrating the sort of professional thoroughness that distinguished organized criminal enterprise from amateur opportunism. Purbright examined once again the small collection of physical evidence that had accumulated with such promising consistency. The dressmaker's pin with its painted glass head that aspired to pearl status without quite achieving it. The glove button of similar pretension bearing its telltale smudge of coral lipstick. The fragment of velvet from the parish hall pall, still holding the faintest glimmer of cosmetic dust that caught the light like guilty knowledge seeking concealment. Mrs. Dabb's professional expertise had identified only 2 purchases of sea holly lipstick in recent weeks, Mrs. Whitmore herself and Miss Valerie Pert from the draper's shop. The widow possessed both the means and the inclination to acquire genuine pearl accessories. Indeed, would consider it a moral duty to maintain proper standards. Miss Pert, however, a shop assistant with neat hands and new ambitions about her appearance, would be considerably more likely to sport the convincing imitation that financial circumstances demanded. The distinction carried weight in Flaxborough's carefully calibrated social hierarchy, where the difference between genuine and imitation materials spoke volumes about both resources and aspirations. It was the sort of detail that would never survive scrutiny in a metropolitan court, but in a town where everyone's circumstances were matters of common knowledge, it possessed roughly the authority of a sworn statement. More significantly, Miss Pert's position in the draper's establishment had provided ideal opportunity for the systematic administration of the pharmaceutical preparations that Dr. Malley had identified with such professional concern. A man who accepted his daily cordial from a familiar shop assistant would scarcely glance at the contents, particularly when routine had established the gesture as natural as the bell above the door announcing customers. The inspector's consideration of human motivations led him to reflect upon the delicate process by which respectable individuals might be drawn into criminal activity without recognizing the true nature of their participation. Provincial mischief, he had observed, rarely began as crime in its own mind. People were invited to be useful, to demonstrate loyalty, to show their sophistication by understanding arrangements that required discretion. Miss Pert's eager cooperation with recent inquiries had carried the particular tone of someone rehearsing truth while carefully omitting the details that might prove inconvenient. Her accounts of Mr. Whitmore's mysterious London visitor, the special orders that seemed outside their usual business, and the deceased's growing anxiety had been delivered with the precision of someone who had given considerable thought to presenting facts in their most favorable light. The funeral arrangements themselves revealed a masterpiece of misdirection that exploited Flaxborough's social dynamics with surgical precision. The older lipstick mark on the Coffin nameplate, that deep crimson passion red, had been positioned to draw immediate attention to Miss Carmichael's romantic entanglement with the deceased. Mr. Jevons had purchased the identical shade and inquired specifically about permanence, suggesting coordination between the journalist's professional curiosity and someone's desire to ensure that evidence would survive long enough to create the desired impression. The mysterious cousin by marriage who had adjusted the pall during the funeral preparations emerged as a key figure in the elaborate deception. Mr. Sprott's observations about gloves with pearl buttons and a scent like expensive sweets that had been told not to be too cheerful suggested local origins rather than London sophistication. The fussing over fabric that hung crooked and would give offense spoke of nervous energy seeking physical outlet, the sort of agitation that accompanied unfamiliar criminal activity rather than practiced deception. Mrs. Whitmore's role in the conspiracy appeared to extend considerably beyond mere complicity. Her systematic editing of business records, her convenient discovery of her husband's private journal, and her remarkably composed management of the transition from wife to widow suggested someone who had participated in planning rather than merely accepting circumstances. The theatrical kiss she had bestowed upon the Coffin nameplate had served to expose the planted evidence while establishing her own apparent innocence of its placement. The pharmaceutical operation revealed sophistication that extended far beyond Flaxborough's boundaries, involving resources and expertise that suggested considerable financial backing and professional criminal organization. The 17 vials in the uncollected parcel represented merely one component of a distribution network that had used the draper's shop as a staging post for activities that extended throughout the rural districts. Mr. Whitmore's death had solved the immediate problem of his moral objections while creating the opportunity for a controlled investigation that would satisfy official requirements without revealing the true extent of the criminal enterprise. The coordination required to manage such complex deception spoke of minds that understood perfectly how to exploit the trust and discretion that governed provincial social relationships. As the evening advanced toward night, Purbright found himself confronting the uncomfortable reality that Flaxborough's apparently placid surface had concealed activities of considerable criminal sophistication. The case demanded resolution that would serve justice while protecting the innocent victims of elaborate manipulation from the full consequences of their unwitting participation. He reached for his pen and began composing invitations that would bring the principal figures together under circumstances that might encourage the sort of revelations that private conversations had failed to produce. The parish hall, scene of the funeral's dramatic developments, would provide an appropriate setting for the final act of a drama that had exploited the town's social machinery with such calculated efficiency. The death of Mr. Cedric Whitmore was approaching its resolution, though the complexity of the deception that had surrounded it would require careful handling to ensure that justice was served without destroying more lives than the crime itself had claimed. In Flaxborough, as Inspector Purbright had learned through long experience, the truth often proved more intricate than the most elaborate fiction, involving ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances that tested the boundaries between respectability and criminality in ways that defied simple judgment. The next morning would bring the final gathering of those whose lives had been touched by the draper's death, and with it the opportunity for truth to emerge from the carefully constructed web of deception that had made murder appear as natural as the autumn leaves falling in Market Square. The invitations that Inspector Purbright had composed the previous evening bore the courteous formality that made refusal seem churlish rather than prudent. By 10 o'clock, the parish hall had filled once again with the principal figures whose lives had been touched by Mr. Whitmore's death, though the atmosphere differed considerably from the funeral gathering that had initiated the current complications. Mrs. Bracegirdle had arranged the folding chairs in a thoughtful semicircle, their placement suggesting consultation rather than interrogation. The green baize pall lay folded upon its familiar trestle, while nearby, arranged with museum-like precision upon a smaller table, were the various items that had accumulated during the investigation: the chemist's envelope, the dressmaker's pin with its painted glass head, the glove button of similar pretension, and several of the pharmaceutical vials that had arrived so punctually each Thursday. Miss Carmichael entered with the composed efficiency that had marked all her appearances in Flaxborough, settling herself where the morning light fell obliquely across her chair. Her manner suggested someone attending a business meeting of moderate importance, though her eyes moved with professional assessment across the assembled evidence. Mrs. Whitmore arrived with the measured dignity that had characterized her approach to widowhood, her coral lipstick applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearances carried particular weight in such circumstances. She acknowledged the other attendees with the sort of public courtesy that revealed nothing of private thoughts. Miss Valerie Pert appeared in the company of Mrs. Dabb, their conversation proceeding in hushed tones that suggested matters of considerable delicacy. The shop assistant's nervous energy manifested itself in small adjustments to her gloves and coat, movements that spoke of internal tension seeking physical outlet. The gathering was completed by Dr. Malley, Mr. Hargreaves, Mr. Jevons with his discreetly concealed notebook, Councillor Haxby wearing his official expression of civic concern, and Mr. Mossop, who had brought the pall with the professional thoroughness that marked his approach to all ceremonial requirements. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Purbright began, when the chairs had settled into their customary squeaks and sighs, "I am grateful for your patience with what might seem an unusual request. Recent events have raised questions about the arrangements at Mr. Whitmore's funeral. Nothing dramatic, you understand, but the sort of details that require clarification to satisfy official curiosity. His manner suggested nothing more pressing than administrative tidiness, though his thumb pressed against his forefinger in that subtle gesture which indicated heightened attention to developing circumstances. "Mrs. Brace-Girdle, would you be so kind as to describe how the pall was arranged initially?" Mrs. Brace-Girdle rose with the authority of someone whose organizational skills had been tested by decades of committee work. Mr. Mossop provided it with the chalk marking clearly visible, top at the head end, as is proper. We positioned it carefully, though we were obliged to turn it twice due to that unfortunate trestle incident. "Quite so. And Mr. Sprott mentioned a visitor, described as a cousin by marriage, who found the draping unsatisfactory. Perhaps we might demonstrate what required adjustment." Mr. Mossop shook out the pall with practiced efficiency, the heavy fabric falling across the trestle with dignified weight. The chalk marking showed clearly, though its position had shifted during the ceremonial turnings that had marked the funeral's more complicated moments. A brief silence settled over the assembly, broken by the sort of polite hesitation that accompanies requests for voluntary demonstration. It was Miss Pert who stepped forward, her movement carrying the eager helpfulness that had characterized her assistance throughout the investigation. "The fold was catching the light rather awkwardly," she explained, her hands moving with the deft precision of someone accustomed to managing fabric. "If one brings this edge forward just slightly—" Her fingers lifted the hem, smoothed the corner where Mr. Sprott had observed the earlier adjustments, then moved with unconscious accuracy to a position precisely 7 inches from the head end, the exact location where the mysterious envelope had been discovered. Without apparent thought, her hand dipped toward her coat pocket, producing a small pincushion of cheap ribbon and painted glass before she caught herself, the apologetic smile arriving too late to conceal the automatic gesture. The pin matched exactly the evidence on Purbright's table. Same pearly pretension, same tiny flaw in the painted surface. "We always carry pins at the shop," she offered, her explanation carrying the ring of truth while somehow failing to address the implications of such preparedness. "Most practical," Purbright observed mildly, "though one must be careful about placement when the head end changes position. After the second turning, I'm told the chalk marking lay at what had become the foot of the coffin." Miss Pert's glance toward him carried the quick alertness of someone who understood perfectly the significance of the observation. "I suppose one could still find the proper position," she said, "if one had noted the location previously." Mrs. Brace-Girdle, whose familiarity with municipal fabrics extended to their weight, texture, and proper handling, had been watching with the sharp attention of someone whose expertise recognized both competence and suspicious familiarity. "The velvet requires careful treatment," she observed to the air, "particularly when pins are involved." Purbright allowed the silence to develop its own weight before continuing with his gentle inquiries. "There is another small matter that requires attention. Mr. Hargreaves has reported the discourteous removal of certain pages from his sales ledger. The intruder left behind this button. He placed the small object on his palm, where the morning light caught the painted surface that aspired to pearl status without quite achieving it. Miss Pert's left glove, black cotton stitched with the earnestness that marked her approach to economy, rested on the bench. Beside her, her movement toward it paused as she seemed to reconsider the wisdom of drawing attention to the frayed thread at the wrist, where something had been removed with more determination than skill. "It might belong to anyone," she said with the brave confidence of someone whose honesty had been pressed into service for less straightforward purposes. "Indeed it might," Purbright agreed, allowing the button to remain unclaimed. "We shall preserve it in case the owner develops sufficient courage to acknowledge the loss." Dr. Malley, who had been observing the proceedings with medical detachment, cleared his throat with the authority of professional expertise. "Inspector, if there is reason to suppose that substances were administered to Mr. Whitmore prior to his death, the law will require me to recommend exhumation. It involves considerable disruption and public attention, circumstances I should prefer to avoid if alternative explanations prove available. The mention of exhumation introduced a gravity to the proceedings that made the assembled company shift with visible discomfort. Miss Pert's hands tightened in her lap until the knuckles showed white beneath the black cotton. "I never meant any harm," she said in a rush that begged to be called confession while not quite achieving it. "I only did as I was instructed." The cordial was supposed to help with his digestion. He complained so often about feeling poorly after lunch. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, carrying implications that extended far beyond the simple act of kindness it purported to describe. "Quite natural," Purbright observed, with a gentle understanding that encouraged further revelation. "No one questions the kindness of assistance, though one might wonder about the wisdom of those who provided the instructions." He turned then to the evidence table, lifting the small chemist's envelope with the casual attention one might give to examining a pressed flower. Curious how such papers find their way beneath ceremonial poles. One would think the weight of grief quite sufficient to keep things properly arranged. His placement of the envelope upon the velvet, positioned at the precise location where Miss Pert's hands had moved with such unconscious accuracy, required no additional comment. The significance was written in the shop assistant's expression, which had acquired the attentive misery of someone waiting to discover whether punishment or forgiveness would prove the more uncomfortable option. "There will be conversations tomorrow," Purbright announced, his voice carrying the gentle finality that marked his more significant decisions. "Private discussions that will allow everyone to explain their participation in recent events without unnecessary public attention. I find that people sleep more comfortably when their consciences have been properly aired." The gathering dispersed with the awkward efficiency of people who had discovered that social obligations could extend into areas considerably more complex than usual community activities. Miss Pert departed without meeting anyone's gaze, while Mrs. Whitmore paused to thank Mrs. Bracegirdle for arrangements that had been, as always, entirely adequate. Miss Carmichael, collecting her umbrella with practiced grace, remarked pleasantly to Purbright, "You will, I think, make everything quite tidy," and left him with the impression that professional criminals possessed their own standards of craftsmanship that extended to appreciating competent opposition. Standing alone in the parish hall as the voices faded into the autumn afternoon, Inspector Purbright reflected upon the curious dynamics that had transformed a simple funeral into a masterpiece of misdirection. Tomorrow would bring the formal revelations that would satisfy law, medicine, and journalism, while protecting the innocent from the full consequences of their unwitting participation in activities that had exploited their trust with such calculated precision. The test had accomplished what such exercises should. It had convinced everyone involved that concealment had become considerably more difficult than cooperation, while demonstrating that in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, the most dangerous deceptions were often those that exploited the very virtues that made communities possible in the first place. The morning following Inspector Purbright's demonstration in the parish hall brought to Flaxborough that particular quality of autumnal clarity that made even the most complicated human arrangements appear susceptible to reasonable resolution. The inspector had arranged his office with the careful attention to comfort that marked occasions when truth required gentle encouragement rather than official pressure. Though the evidence table bore witness to more serious matters than tea and sympathy might address. Mrs. Whitmore arrived first, her appearance suggesting someone who had spent considerable time preparing for a conversation that would require all her considerable reserves of composure. Miss Valerie Pert followed with movements that spoke of nervous resolution, her black coat brushed to respectability, and her gloves mended with neat stitches that had begged for more time than circumstances had allowed. Miss Carmichael entered last among the principals, cool as a ledger total and twice as precise. Dr. Malley, Mr. Hargreaves, and Mr. Jevons took positions that suggested witnesses to proceedings they had helped make necessary, while Councillor Haxby entered with a solemnity that was rather louder than the room required. Purbright remained standing, addressing the assembled company with a mild courtesy that made official inquiries feel more like social calls, with unusually serious purposes. "It is a curious thing," he began, his gaze encompassing the group without settling accusingly upon any individual, "how a town that prides itself on plainness can produce such embroidery when circumstances require it. Mr. Whitmore died of what a physician, examining only the immediate cause, could certify without hesitation as natural heart failure. He was assisted to that conclusion, however, by a course of treatment applied with systematic dedication, but not with benevolent intent." Miss Pert's hands, which had been attempting to maintain dignified stillness, betrayed their owner by beginning to tremble with the sort of fine vibration that accompanies the recognition of uncomfortable truths. The treatment was administered as a cordial, something to settle digestive complaints that had grown troublesome in recent months. There is a particular kindness that consists in never failing with the bottle and the glass, in being always present when discomfort requires attention. One notices such reliability. One becomes grateful. And when one's symptoms worsen on specific days, Thursdays for instance, one attributes the pattern to business stress and the accumulated weight of weekly responsibilities. Dr. Malley's slight cough acknowledged his own earlier diagnostic certainty while expressing appropriate professional regret about conclusions that had proved insufficient to the complexity of human malice. The pharmaceutical preparations we discovered in the uncollected parcel, the vials now secured as evidence, and the careful notations in Mr. Whitmore's private journal create a pattern that speaks to systematic intervention rather than natural decline. The deceased had grown increasingly concerned about the true nature of the London association he had been persuaded to support. His journal records growing moral qualms about activities he had initially accepted as legitimate commercial consulting. Purbright turned a page in his notebook with the unhurried precision of a man ensuring his punctuation remained beyond criticism. This left two categories of persons with compelling reasons for concern: those whose profitable arrangements depended upon his continued cooperation, and those whose domestic tranquility required his permanent silence about activities that might prove embarrassing to explain to official inquiry. His attention settled briefly upon Mrs. Whitmore, whose composure had acquired the particular quality of porcelain under stress. Beautiful, but showing hairline cracks that suggested imminent structural failure. The funeral arrangements, Mrs. Whitmore demonstrated remarkable foresight for someone supposedly overwhelmed by sudden grief. Your kiss upon the coffin nameplate was positioned with theatrical precision to ensure maximum dramatic effect. More significantly, it was calculated to draw attention to evidence that had been carefully planted to suggest romantic complications rather than pharmaceutical murder. The widow's hand moved unconsciously toward her throat, where no comforting jewelry rested to provide distraction from the inspector's gentle but relentless analysis. The older, lipstick mark, that distinctive passion red shade, had been applied by someone familiar with our chemist's inventory and possessed of sufficient local knowledge to understand how such evidence would be interpreted by Flaxborough's social network. Mr. Jevons's purchase of the identical cosmetic, undertaken at the suggestion of parties interested in ensuring proper misdirection, provided the physical means for creating false evidence of romantic entanglement. The journalist's pencil, which had been moving with practiced efficiency across his notebook, paused as he recognized his own unwitting participation in the elaborate deception that had surrounded the funeral arrangements. The envelope discovered beneath the ceremonial pall presents more damning evidence of premeditation. Mr. Mossop had marked top clearly upon the fabric, yet after the trestle collapsed and necessitated refolding, the envelope was found at what had become the head end when the original marking lay at the foot. This represents a physical impossibility unless the placement had been accomplished by someone who had noted the earlier position with the precise attention of a person accustomed to managing fabric arrangements professionally. Miss Pert made a small sound that might have been the beginning of tears in different circumstances, though current necessities required it to learn the discipline of silence. Miss Pert possesses exactly such professional familiarity with textile management. Her demonstration yesterday revealed unconscious knowledge of the Paul's original positioning, while the evidence of her presence at the parish hall, described by Mr. Sprott as a cousin by marriage with nervous energy requiring physical outlet, establishes both opportunity and method for the envelope's placement. The shop assistant's composure finally surrendered to the weight of accumulated revelation. "I never meant harm to anyone," she whispered, her voice carrying the particular misery of someone discovering that good intentions could be manipulated toward evil purposes. "Mrs. Whitmore said the cordial would help settle his stomach. He complained so often about feeling poorly after meals. She said the London preparations were more effective than conventional remedies, and that doctor Manley had recommended such treatment for digestive complaints. The pharmaceutical compounds were indeed designed to address digestive issues," Purbright confirmed with gentle precision, though their intended effect was to create rather than cure such symptoms. The systematic administration of these preparations over several weeks produced exactly the cardiac stress that ultimately proved fatal to Mr. Whitmore's weakened constitution. Mrs. Whitmore's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the controlled precision of someone who had recognized that circumstances no longer permitted the luxury of complete concealment. "Inspector, you cannot comprehend the burden of living with a man whose moral scruples threatened the security of everything we had worked to establish. Cedric was not wicked, merely weak. Society expects wives to manage their husbands' deficiencies while condemning us for the methods such management requires. The grievance is understandable," Purbright acknowledged with the sort of judicial fairness that made condemnation more rather than less effective. The remedy, however, extended considerably beyond the boundaries of acceptable domestic management. Miss Carmichael's contribution to the proceedings carried the professional frankness of someone who understood that cooperation might prove more advantageous than obstinate silence. "If the court requires testimony, Inspector, I shall state that I endeavored to withdraw my firm's association when Mr. Whitmore's emotional distress became apparent. He would not be the first provincial gentleman to mistake commercial arrangements for personal sentiment. The pharmaceutical preparations found in your evidence came from suppliers whose methods I had begun to question. Your assistance will be noted appropriately," Purbright replied, the phrase carrying implications of both gratitude and warning about the limits of official tolerance for such cooperation. The formalities that followed such revelations proceeded with the quiet efficiency that marked Flaxborough's approach to managing scandal without destroying the social fabric that made community life possible. Mrs. Whitmore was taken into custody with the sort of dignified discretion that acknowledged her previous respectability while recognizing the necessity of justice. Miss Pert accompanied the sergeant with the tender consideration usually reserved for people who had discovered something broken within themselves without yet knowing whether repair remained possible. By afternoon, Market Square had resumed the familiar rhythms of commerce and gossip that constituted its claim to moral seriousness. Shop bells performed their proper duties with renewed dedication to routine. At the Royal George, Miss Carmichael settled her account and departed on the evening train, her luggage notably lighter than might have been expected for someone who had arrived with such extensive business interests. Mr. Hargreaves returned to his pharmaceutical duties with renewed attention to the proper documentation of all transactions, while Mr. Jevons composed an article whose most notable feature would prove to be its remarkable discretion about matters that might have provided considerably more dramatic copy in less responsible hands. In his office, Inspector Purbright completed the necessary correspondence with the methodical thoroughness that marked his approach to cases that required careful handling to serve justice without destroying more lives than the original crime had claimed. The report to the chief constable emphasized medical facts and legal necessities while omitting the sort of colorful details that might prove embarrassing to provincial administration. The communication to the coroner provided sufficient evidence to support the required verdict, while avoiding complications that might necessitate more extensive investigation. A third letter, composed but not sent, addressed itself to a metropolitan colleague who had once inquired about the supposed tedium of small-town policing. Purbright explained, with the dry patience of a man folding handkerchiefs with geometric precision, that there existed very little tedium in communities where everyone understood how everyone else behaved, while no one quite comprehended the reasons underlying such predictable patterns. This unsent correspondence found its way into a file marked Personal Observations, where such reflections accumulated until they yellowed into something approaching wisdom about the persistent complexity of human nature beneath the most placid social surfaces. The drawer containing physical evidence, pins, papers, buttons, and the various pharmaceutical preparations that had made murder appear as natural as autumn weather, closed with its customary soft finality. Outside the station window, a delivery boy cycled past while whistling something cheerful and entirely off-key, which struck the inspector as exactly appropriate to the occasion. There would be legal proceedings, naturally, conducted with the county's reluctant competence and featuring testimony that would carefully avoid exploring the larger criminal enterprise that had used Flaxborough as merely one component in a considerably more extensive operation. Mrs. Whitmore would present her actions as domestic management gone tragically astray, while Miss Peart would tell the truth with a sort of trembling honesty that made conviction inevitable while ensuring that punishment reflected manipulation rather than malicious intent. The pharmaceutical network would become a cautionary tale at social gatherings, while the London connections would fade into the sort of vague metropolitan menace that provincial communities found both frightening and oddly comforting to contemplate from safe distances. Inspector Purbright returned, as he invariably did, to the small but essential business of making Flaxborough reasonably safe for people who deceive themselves without malicious intent, while remaining appropriately vigilant against those whose deceptions served considerably less innocent purposes. He initialed a requisition for new blotting paper, composed a reminder about the parish hall's security arrangements, and allowed himself the brief satisfaction of a case concluded with appropriate attention to both justice and the preservation of community stability. Toward evening, light rain began falling with the apologetic persistence that local weather had learned from observing its inhabitants' approach to difficult conversations. The pavements acquired their familiar shine, while in St. Bartholomew's churchyard, Mr. Toffee paused beside the Whitmore headstone to observe that the engraving had been executed with proper professional skill. Somewhere in the town, someone would be telling the story of the widow who had kissed the coffin with such calculated precision, and someone else would respond that such complications had always seemed inevitable, while a third party would note that none of these difficulties arose when people minded their own affairs with appropriate diligence. Perhaps not. But then Inspector Purbright would have been obliged to develop hobbies, which represented a dangerous tendency in policemen who had grown accustomed to finding sufficient entertainment in the reliable complexity of human nature operating beneath the most respectable appearances. He adjusted his hat to its customary angle, nodded farewell to his colleagues, and departed for home, where supper awaited with the sort of domestic predictability that left no traces in medical literature and required no explanatory nameplates to establish its essential innocence. The end.